My name is Jhon, and this is Plane Crashed, where we uncover the haunting truths buried beneath the wreckage of history's most shocking air disasters. Every twisted piece of metal, every last word from the cockpit, and every haunting second on the flight recorder tells a story, one not just of mechanical failure or bad weather, but of human error, overlooked warnings, and moments when the smallest mistake changed hundreds of lives forever. Tonight, we journey into the heart of those errors, where the line between precision and tragedy is thinner than the wing of an aircraft slicing through the clouds. In aviation, perfection is not an aspiration, it is survival. Every button pressed, every decision made, and every second of hesitation matters. It's a world where one small oversight can trigger a chain reaction of fatal consequences. Air France Flight 447 was supposed to be another routine transatlantic crossing from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, carrying 228 souls across the ocean. The aircraft, an Airbus A330, represented the very peak of aviation technology, equipped with advanced flight control systems and redundant safety mechanisms that made pilots and passengers alike feel invincible. But what happened that night in June 2009 revealed the chilling truth. No machine, no matter how advanced, can protect against human error when confusion takes control. The flight took off smoothly into the Brazilian night, the city lights fading beneath as the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude. The passengers settled in, unaware that a line of violent thunderstorms waited ahead over the Atlantic. The pilots, experienced but fatigued, navigated toward the turbulence, their radar showing flashes of red and yellow that marked the storm cells. They adjusted their path, as countless crews had done before. But inside that turbulent sky, a silent enemy awaited. Ice crystals invisible to the naked eye, capable of freezing critical senses. At 2:10 a.m., the aircraft's pitot tubes, small sensors on the fuselage that measure airspeed, began to freeze. The cockpit displays flickered. Warnings erupted. The autopilot, no longer receiving reliable speed data, disengaged automatically, forcing the pilots to take manual control. In that moment, the safety net of automation vanished, and 3 men were left to interpret a flood of conflicting information. The captain had left the cockpit moments earlier for his rest break, leaving 2 co-pilots to manage the storm. As the alarms sounded, they struggled to make sense of the situation. The instruments disagreed, the flight path was unstable, and the darkness outside offered no visual cues. Without clear airspeed readings, the aircraft's computer could not provide accurate guidance, and within seconds, confusion began to take hold. One of the co-pilots, trained to respond to a perceived loss of lift, instinctively pulled back on his control stick, trying to climb away from what he thought was a descent. But the aircraft was not descending. It was already at high altitude, where thin air made every movement more critical. By pulling back, he pitched the nose upward, causing the airspeed to drop further. The stall warning blared repeatedly, yet in the chaos, the sound of alarms merged into a wall of noise. "What's happening?" one pilot shouted. "We've lost control." The Airbus was now climbing steeply, losing speed rapidly. Within a minute, it reached a dangerous altitude of over 38,000 feet and began to stall. The nose pitched upward at an angle no aircraft could sustain. The engines roared, but they could not overcome gravity. The jet began to fall, not in a spiral but in a level, deadly descent, wings nearly flat slicing through the dark void. The pilots, disoriented, continued to pull back on the controls, believing they were in a dive when in fact they were stalling higher and higher into thin air. The stall warning ceased momentarily, not because the danger was gone, but because the sensors no longer detected enough airflow over the wings to measure the stall. That silence gave them false reassurance. "We're climbing again," one said, though in reality they were plunging toward the ocean at 10,000 feet per minute. The captain rushed back into the cockpit, woken by the alarms and confusion. He looked around and tried to make sense of the scene. An altitude rapidly dropping, inconsistent readings, and two co-pilots speaking over each other, each convinced of a different scenario. In those critical minutes, communication broke down completely. "Pitch down! Pitch down!" one shouted. "No, we're diving," the other insisted. The captain asked, "What's going on?" But there was no clear answer. The instruments showed madness, altitude decreasing, vertical speed fluctuating, alarms blaring, and outside, nothing but darkness and storm. The aircraft's flight path indicator was screaming for recovery, but the crew was locked in a deadly feedback loop of confusion and overcorrection. For nearly 4 minutes, the Airbus fell from the sky, wings level, nose slightly raised, engines still producing thrust. It wasn't a catastrophic failure. It was a slow-motion loss of awareness. In the final moments, one pilot realized the truth. "We're going to crash," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. Seconds later, the Airbus struck the Atlantic Ocean with the force of a bomb, disintegrating instantly and leaving no survivors. The wreckage would not be found for 2 years, lying deep beneath the sea at a depth of nearly 13,000 feet. When investigators finally recovered the black boxes, the data revealed a haunting story, not of mechanical failure, but of human misjudgment amplified by stress, darkness, and uncertainty. The systems worked as designed. The engines never failed. The wings never broke. The aircraft was fully capable of flying, but the pilots, trapped in the fog of confusion, never recognized that they were in a stall. The final minutes of the flight were a devastating lesson in how easily human perception can be overwhelmed. The official investigation by the French BEA concluded that the crew had lost situational awareness and failed to apply proper stall recovery procedures. Their training had not adequately prepared them for high-altitude manual flight under unreliable instrument conditions. The automation that once made flying safer had also dulled basic manual skills, creating pilots who were brilliant at managing systems but less confident when stripped of them. Air France Flight 447 became a turning point in aviation history, prompting deep reflection across the industry. Airlines re-evaluated their training programs, emphasizing manual flying skills and scenario-based training for high-altitude stalls. Airbus and Boeing reviewed their cockpit alert systems to reduce sensory overload during emergencies. Pilots began receiving more realistic simulator sessions that included unreliable airspeed scenarios and manual control at cruise altitude, something rarely practiced before. But beyond the technical lessons, Flight 447 revealed something more profound: the fragility of human decision-making under pressure. In the sterile calm of a simulator, stall recovery is straightforward. Lower the nose, increase thrust, regain airflow. But in the chaos of a dark night over the ocean, with alarms screaming and data conflicting, instinct can betray logic. Humans are wired to react emotionally to danger, and when instincts clash with instruments, disaster can strike even in the most advanced cockpit on Earth. The tragedy also exposed another uncomfortable truth about aviation culture: deference. In hierarchical flight decks, co-pilots often hesitate to challenge their captain's judgment or admit confusion. Although the captain of Flight 447 had been resting, the return to the cockpit came too late to reassert command. The brief moments of uncertainty between pilots, "What should we do? I don't know anymore," were enough to ensure catastrophe. It was a reminder that teamwork in the cockpit is not just about skill, but about communication, assertiveness, and trust. The haunting recordings of that night echo a chilling pattern found in other crashes: experienced crews undone by confusion, silence, or deference when decisive clarity was needed most. Air France Flight 447 is now studied in aviation academies worldwide as a textbook example of human factors, the psychological and cognitive elements that can lead to tragedy even when everything mechanical functions perfectly. The event redefined how pilots are trained to handle automation failures, emphasizing not just procedural knowledge, but emotional control and cognitive resilience. It underscored that aviation safety is not just built on steel and circuitry, but on human adaptability. For the families of those lost, the discovery of the wreckage brought closure, but also a grim sense of irony. The aircraft had remained intact until impact, meaning it could have been saved at any point in those 4 agonizing minutes. Every second, the pilots had the power to correct the situation, if only they had recognized what was happening. That fact haunts the industry to this day. In the years since, automation has become even more sophisticated. But the memory of Flight 447 serves as a constant reminder that pilots are not passengers of their own machines. They are the final safeguard. No algorithm can replicate the intuition, awareness, and calm that human pilots must possess when everything begins to unravel. The story of Flight 447 is not simply about loss. It's about the delicate balance between human trust and technological dependency. It asks a question that aviation continues to wrestle with. As aircraft become smarter, are pilots becoming less prepared for when the system fails? The ocean that night was mercilessly calm, the sky pitch black, and the silence after the impact eternal. But from that silence, an entire industry learned that mistakes in air crash investigation are not just about finding what broke. They are about understanding why, in the most critical moment, the human heart and mind sometimes fail to keep pace with the machine they command. On a cold January night in 1990, Avianca Flight 52, a Boeing 707 traveling from Bogota, Colombia, to New York, approached its final destination after a long and exhausting journey. On board were 158 passengers and crew, eager to land after hours in the air. They had already faced multiple delays, diversions, and holding patterns due to heavy air traffic over the New York area. By the time they neared John F. Kennedy International Airport, their fuel levels were dangerously low. The passengers could not have known that they were minutes away from tragedy, not because of a technical failure or bad weather, but because of something far more human: miscommunication, misunderstanding, and a failure of words that would lead to disaster. The crew of Flight 52 had endured a challenging trip. The aircraft had already been delayed on departure, forced to circle for hours in turbulent skies, burning fuel as they waited for clearance to land. The weather over New York was rough, visibility poor, and air traffic congested. By the time the flight was handed over to U.S. air traffic controllers, its fuel reserves were already below safe levels. Inside the cockpit, Captain Laureano Caviedes, First Officer Mauricio Klotz, and Flight Engineer Matias Moyano were tense but calm. They knew they were low on fuel. They knew they needed to land soon. But in the world of aviation communication, words matter more than tone, and the words they chose would determine their fate. "We're running low on fuel," the co-pilot radioed calmly to air traffic control. The controllers acknowledged and advised the crew to continue holding due to congestion. What they didn't realize was that the crew's statement was not just a casual update, it was a desperate warning. In aviation terminology, saying low on fuel is not the same as declaring a fuel emergency. The latter, communicated with the specific phrase Mayday or minimum fuel emergency, triggers an immediate response. It clears the airspace, prioritizes the aircraft, and allows controllers to bring it in as soon as possible. But the Avianca crew, non-native English speakers trained in a different aviation culture, never used those words. They believed that saying, "We're running low on fuel," would convey the urgency. To the American controllers, it sounded routine. As Flight 52 continued to circle over New York, every minute burned what little remained in its tanks. The cockpit voice recorder captured the increasing tension among the crew. The flight engineer repeatedly warned, "We're running out of fuel, Captain." The captain responded, "I know, we'll be landing soon." But they weren't cleared yet. They were instructed to enter another holding pattern near Long Island. The aircraft descended into clouds. the passengers unaware of how dire their situation had become. The engines continued to hum, but behind that steady sound lay a countdown ticking toward disaster. When finally cleared for approach, the relief in the cockpit was palpable. They aligned with the runway and began their descent. But just as the runway lights appeared through the mist, the weather worsened again. Strong winds pushed them off course. The captain attempted to correct, but the aircraft was too high and too fast. The landing had to be aborted. "Go around," the tower instructed. The engines roared as the 707 climbed once more, using up the last of its precious fuel. That decision, routine for most flights, was fatal for this one. As the aircraft circled again, the flight engineer's voice became urgent. "We don't have fuel to go around again, Captain." The captain radioed to air traffic control once more, his voice now strained. "We're running out of fuel." "Okay, sir, we'll get you in as soon as possible," came the calm response from the ground. But it was already too late. At 9:34 p.m., one of the engines sputtered and flamed out. Then another. The once powerful Boeing 707 began to lose altitude. The cockpit filled with warning alarms. "We lost the engines," one pilot shouted. The captain tried desperately to restart them, but the gauges read 0. The fuel tanks were dry. The co-pilot made one final radio call. "We're running out of fuel. We can't maintain altitude." There was no time for a response. The aircraft, powerless and gliding through the darkness, clipped trees and crashed into a wooded hillside near Cove Neck, Long Island. The impact tore the plane apart. Of the 158 people on board, 73 perished instantly, including 8 crew members. Survivors described chaos. The lights going out, the sound of trees ripping through metal, and then silence. When rescuers arrived, they found parts of the fuselage scattered across the frozen ground, the smell of jet fuel mingling with smoke and cold air. It was a scene of devastation that didn't have to happen. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, arrived quickly, puzzled by how a perfectly functional aircraft had simply run out of fuel so close to one of the world's busiest airports. There was no sign of mechanical failure, no evidence of sabotage or structural issues. The engines were intact. They had just stopped because there was nothing left to burn. The cockpit voice recordings soon revealed the heartbreaking truth. The crew had never formally declared an emergency. In their communications, the word emergency or mayday was never used, even in the final minutes. Instead, their tone grew more urgent, but their phrasing remained polite, indirect, and tragically misunderstood. The investigation uncovered layers of cultural and linguistic differences that had played a silent role in the disaster. In Colombian aviation culture at the time, there was a tendency toward politeness and deference in communication, especially with authority figures. It was considered inappropriate to sound demanding or aggressive, even in crisis. This cultural mindset translated into radio communication that sounded calm and respectful, but lacked the clear, standardized urgency that U.S. controllers were trained to recognize. Moreover, the phrase, "we're running low on fuel," had been commonly used among Latin American crews to signal a serious situation, but in international aviation English, it did not carry the same weight. The misunderstanding was deadly. The controllers later testified that they were never aware of how critical the situation was. They had dozens of planes to manage and assumed Avianca 52 was simply another delayed flight. By the time they realized the severity, radar showed the aircraft descending rapidly and then disappearing. The NTSB's final report concluded that the probable cause was the crew's failure to properly communicate a fuel emergency, combined with the controller's failure to recognize the urgency of the situation. But beneath those official words lay something deeper, a human story of exhaustion, miscommunication, and the tragic consequences of assumption. The investigation led to sweeping changes in global aviation training. Airlines around the world began to emphasize standard phraseology, teaching pilots that in moments of crisis there is no room for improvisation or politeness, only clarity. The phrase "Mayday fuel" or minimum fuel became mandatory when reserves dropped below a certain threshold. Controllers, too, were trained to listen not only to words, but to tone and context, to detect stress that might signal an unspoken emergency. Crew Resource Management, CRM, a system focused on teamwork, assertiveness and communication, was reinforced across the industry. Pilots were taught that in critical situations they must be direct, even forceful, regardless of hierarchy or cultural norms. Flight 52 became a cornerstone case study in aviation safety schools, a lesson not in mechanical failure, but in human communication. Survivors later recalled how calm the crew had seemed throughout the ordeal. Even as the engines died, there was no screaming in the cockpit, no sign of panic. One survivor said it felt like they were still trying to land, even when everything stopped working. That professionalism, while admirable, may have masked the desperation that needed to be conveyed to the ground. Words, or the lack of them, had sealed their fate. In the years following the crash, families of the victims pushed for reforms to ensure that language barriers would never again cost lives. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, began requiring English proficiency testing for pilots and air traffic controllers working in international airspace. This wasn't about accent or fluency. It was about understanding and using the precise vocabulary that keeps people alive. The story of Avianca Flight 52 stands as a haunting reminder that aviation is as much about communication as it is about control. A plane can have the most advanced systems in the world, but if the people operating it fail to speak the same language, literally and professionally, it can all fall apart in seconds. The crash also exposed the quiet dangers of fatigue and pressure. The crew had been awake for long hours, dealing with constant delays, turbulence and changing weather. Fatigue clouds judgment, slows reaction time, and makes it harder to make critical decisions under stress. When combined with language barriers and hierarchical cockpit culture, it becomes a recipe for tragedy. The lessons learned from Flight 52 reshaped not only communication training, but also fuel management protocols. Airlines increased minimum fuel reserves for international flights, accounting for potential delays in congested airspace. Controllers were instructed to question aircraft that reported low fuel, clarifying whether it was a standard advisory or a true emergency. The phrase "we're running out" of fuel would never again be left to interpretation. For those who study aviation safety, the crash remains one of the most powerful examples of how small human misunderstandings can lead to massive loss. It's not about blame, it's about recognition. Every word matters. Every hesitation counts. The tragedy of Avianca Flight 52 is not one of technology or fate, but of communication, a human link broken in the chain of safety. That night, as the aircraft fell silent and darkness consumed the cockpit, the pilots were not defeated by machines, but by meaning. A single word, emergency, could have changed everything. It could have cleared the skies, opened the runway, and rewritten history. Instead, it became a word never spoken, echoing forever in the lessons that aviation carries forward. In the end, the skies hold more than the weight of aircraft. They carry the stories of every mistake, every misjudgment, and every hard-earned lesson written in tragedy. Behind every crash lies a chain of moments where human instinct clashed with precision, where silence replaced urgency, and where small errors became irreversible. Yet from every wreckage, the aviation world learns, adapts, and evolves. The mistakes that once brought planes down now keep others aloft. The ghosts of those lost flights are not forgotten. They are the quiet guardians of every takeoff, every landing, and every promise that such errors will never be repeated again.